But nature at times has its own guardians. A deep roar which made the ground tremble and the air vibrate tore through the silence. A lion with an imposing mane and eyes that burned like embers emerged from the shadows. It was not a monster, but a primordial force, a presence that radiated power and ancient wisdom. The lion advanced not with blind fury, but with silent determination. Its steps measured, its gaze fixed on the cowardly farmer. The man, who considered himself master of all, felt an icy fear paralyze his bones. The beast needed no claws or teeth. Its mere presence, the low growl vibrating in its chest, was an unquestionable command. The lion compelled him. With trembling hands, the farmer, now stripped of his arrogance, handed all his food to the old woman, who watched the scene still confused, but with a glimmer of hope in her tired eyes. The heavy night air, previously cut only by the lament of the wind, now vibrated with the tension of a primordial court. The farmer, once a colossus of arrogance and power, cowered, a mere rag of a man before the wild majesty. His hands, which had recently risen in threat, trembled uncontrollably as he deposited, one by one, the items from his bountiful basket at the feet of the old woman. Golden loaves of bread, creamy cheeses, succulent fruits, and even a wineskin. Everything he considered his by right, his reward for hard work, was now stripped from him by a force he did not comprehend, but respected with paralyzing terror. The lion did not move, but its eyes, live embers in the darkness, remained fixed on the farmer. There was no explicit rage, nor the promise of an imminent attack, only a cold vigilance, an unquestionable authority that said, "Fulfill your penance." Every movement of the man was slow, hesitant, as if he feared that any slip could unleash the beast's dormant fury. Sweat ran down his forehead, not only from exertion, but from the icy dread that squeezed his chest. He felt naked, exposed, not only of his possessions but of his dignity and his illusion of control. The old woman, in turn, watched the scene with a mixture of disbelief and a glimmer of hope that began to shine in her clouded eyes. Her stomach rumbled, a cruel reminder of days and nights of deprivation. She had expected punishment, pain, perhaps even the end. But fate, or perhaps nature itself, had woven a different outcome. Slowly, with hands still marked by time and toil, she extended a trembling finger and touched one of the loaves. It was soft, fragrant, a promise of satiety she had not felt in a long time. The lion, with a low growl that sounded more like a deep whisper from the earth, seemed to approve. The farmer was forced to watch. Every piece of food he had planned for his own comfort, for his own bountiful table, was now being handed to someone he considered a thief, a parasite. The humiliation was excruciating. He felt the lion's gaze pierce his soul, but also, somehow, the gaze of the old woman who, without a word, received the forced offering. It was a mirror reflecting his own pettiness, his gratuitous cruelty. The fear of the lion was palpable, but the fear of his own conscience, now forcibly awakened, was an even more subtle and profound torment. The old woman, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years of hunger, took the bread. Her wrinkled fingers held it with an almost sacred reverence. She did not devour it with avidity, as one might expect from someone so famished. Instead, she broke off a small piece, brought it to her lips and chewed slowly, savoring every crumb, every fiber. It was more than food. It was a miracle, an answer to silent prayers, a balm for an exhausted soul. The lion watched, motionless, its presence an anchor in the surreal reality. It was not merely a predator, it was a guardian, a judge, an executor of a forgotten justice. The farmer, still paralyzed, dared not look away. He watched the old woman take an apple, then a piece of cheese. Each bite she took was a stab at his pride, a reminder of his powerlessness. What was a simple theft of milk in his mind had transformed into a brutal lesson, seared into his memory. He felt like a prisoner on his own land, a slave to a fear he never imagined feeling. The beast, with its imposing patience, ensured that the lesson was learned, that the punishment was complete. When the old woman finally finished eating enough to appease the sharpest pangs of hunger, a gleam of strength and gratitude emerged in her eyes. She looked at the lion, and for an instant there seemed to be a mutual recognition, a silent understanding between the wild creature and the vulnerable human. The lion then, with a slow and deliberate movement of its massive head, turned. Its steps, once measured and threatening, became softer, almost ethereal, as it retreated into the shadows from where it had come. There was no farewell roar, only the silence that swallowed its departure, leaving behind the farmer and the old woman, each with the consequences of an unforgettable encounter. The farmer, now free from the lion's physical presence, collapsed onto his knees, his body trembling uncontrollably. Rage, fear, and humiliation bubbled within him. He had been stripped not only of his food, but of his authority, of his unwavering belief in his own power. The old woman, with a loaf of bread still in her hands and a glimpse of restored dignity, looked at the fallen man. The world had turned upside down, and she, the hungry beggar, had been saved by a king of the jungle. But the night was still long, and the seeds of shame and vengeance had been planted in the farmer's heart. The night air, once heavy with the lion's imposing presence, now seemed thin, icy. The farmer, collapsed on his knees, no longer felt the ground beneath him, only the vertigo of humiliation. The tremor that ran through his body was not merely a remnant of the beast's dread, it was the boiling of contained rage, a fury that seethed beneath his skin seeking a target. His eyes, once wide with terror, now narrowed, fixing on the old woman. She, in turn, still held the bread, a piece of cheese and an apple, like newly discovered treasures. The moonlight bathed her wrinkled face, revealing an expression of relief and newfound dignity. She had been saved, fed, and for a brief instant, the world seemed to have bowed to her need. But the lion's departure brought back the harsh reality. The guardian was gone, and the human predator, though cowardly, remained. The farmer, with an effort that seemed to tear his soul, managed to stand. Every muscle protested, but the physical pain was minuscule compared to the wound in his pride. He, the rich man, the lord of land and cattle, had been forced to kneel, to strip himself of his possessions before a beggar and a wild animal. The image of the lion, with its fixed eyes and silent authority, was seared into his mind. But the lion was gone, and the old woman, the true cause of his disgrace, was still there. "You!" The farmer's voice came out hoarse, almost a hiss laden with venom. "You old thief! Look what you've done to me!" The old woman flinched slightly, the glimmer of hope in her eyes wavering. She knew the truce was fragile, that nature's benevolence was ephemeral in the face of human malice. Slowly, she began to gather the other items from the basket, the breads, the cheeses, the fruits, the wineskin, as if to protect them, not just for herself, but from an imminent fury. "I didn't ask for this," she murmured, her voice weak, but with a trace of something the farmer interpreted as insolence. "I just wanted a little milk." "Milk?" The farmer laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh. "You stole, and now, because of you, I've been humiliated, I've been stripped bare. Do you think you're going to keep my food?" His steps were slow, deliberate, as he advanced toward her. There was no longer the fear of the lion in his eyes, only a cold, calculating determination. He was not a man for direct confrontation when the threat was greater than himself, but against an old, hungry woman. He felt back in control. "That food is mine," he snarled, reaching for the basket. "All of it. The lion forced me to give it, but the lion is gone. Now give it back." The old woman recoiled a step, clutching the bread to her chest. She had felt the satiety, the promise of life that food represented. She couldn't simply hand it over, not after everything. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "The lion gave it, not you." Those words were like a fuse. The farmer's face twisted into a mask of fury. The mention of the lion, the memory of his powerlessness, ignited his rage even further. He couldn't attack the beast, but he could crush the source of his shame. "You dare defy me?" he shouted, the volume of his voice echoing in the night. "You, a parasite, a thief, dare tell me no? I'll show you who's in charge here." He took a wide step, almost a lunge, and grabbed the basket forcefully. The old woman, frail and small, had no chance. The basket was ripped from her hands, and some items fell to the ground, rolling in the dust. The bread she held, however, remained firm in her grasp. "Give it back," she pleaded, her voice choked, fear returning with full force. The farmer held the basket, his eyes flashing. He didn't care so much about the food itself, but about the symbolism, the need to reassert his power, to erase the humiliation. He wanted to see fear in her eyes. He wanted her to know her place. "You'll learn not to steal from me, you filthy old hag," he hissed, raising the basket as if it were a trophy. "And you'll learn that charity, when it exists, is mine to give or deny." The old woman, with the bread still in her trembling hands, looked at the farmer, at the basket he held, and at the items scattered on the ground. The night, which had promised a miracle, now closed in on her again, bringing with it the shadow of human cruelty. The farmer, with his uncontrolled rage, seemed ready to go beyond words, to ensure his lesson was felt, not just heard. And the old woman, alone and vulnerable, felt the weight of an uncertain fate hanging over her once more. The farmer's eyes, flashing in the darkness, fixed on the piece of bread the old woman still clutched to her chest. It was not just food, it was a symbol, the last crumb of dignity she had managed to retain. And he would not allow it. His wounded pride demanded the total annihilation of that moment of weakness, that instant when he, the powerful one, had been subjugated. "You won't keep anything!" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous, a chilling contrast to the furious shout of moments before. It was the calm before the storm, a colder, more calculating threat. He advanced a step, then another, his heavy shoes kicking up small clouds of dust. The old woman recoiled, her fragile body trembling, but the bread remained firmly clutched in her wrinkled hands. It was her only defense, her only hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice choked with fear and exhaustion. I was so hungry." "Hunger?" the farmer scoffed, a dry, humorless laugh. "Everyone gets hungry, old woman, but not everyone steals, and I'm not obligated to feed parasites like you." He reached out, not to gently take the bread, but to rip it away with force. The old woman, in a last desperate act of resistance, clutched the bread even tighter, her eyes pleading. But compassion had abandoned the farmer's heart, if it had ever resided there. He pulled violently, and the man's strength, even shaken, was incomparable to that of the old woman. The bread was torn from her hands, and she staggered backward, almost falling. The farmer held the bread, not with the intention of eating it, but of destroying it. His strong fingers crushed the soft crumb, turning what was a promise of life into a pile of crumbs. He threw them to the ground with a gesture of contempt, as if discarding something filthy. "That's what you get for stealing," he hissed, watching the crumbs mix with the dirt. "And that's what you get for defying me." The old woman fell to her knees, not from physical force, but from the pain that pierced her soul. Tears, long dried by deprivation, now welled from her clouded eyes, streaming down the wrinkles of her face. She looked at the crumbs on the ground, at the empty basket in the farmer's hands, and at the darkness that seemed to swallow her again. The brief flame of hope the lion had ignited had been brutally extinguished. The farmer, tasting a bitter victory but still unsatisfied, watched her. He wanted to see more. He wanted her to feel the depth of her humiliation. He wanted her to know that he, and only he, held the power there. "Now, get off my land," he ordered, his voice regaining its former authoritative tone. "And if I see you again, there will be no lion to save you." The old woman did not respond. She merely wept in silence, her body hunched, the image of desolation. The pain of hunger, which had been momentarily appeased, returned with redoubled intensity, mixed with the bitterness of injustice. As the farmer reveled in his newly acquired superiority, a subtle, almost imperceptible sound broke the night's silence. It was not a roar, nor a rustling of leaves. It was something deeper, more primordial, a dragging of heavy paws on the earth, coming from the shadows where the lion had departed. The farmer froze. His body, which had just risen in triumph, stiffened again. Cold sweat began to trickle down his forehead, and the air he breathed seemed thin. He turned slowly, his eyes fixed on the darkness, searching for the source of the sound. There it was, not as close as before, but unmistakable. The massive silhouette of the lion, emerging from the shadows of the trees, its amber eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to pierce the farmer's very soul. The lion did not roar, made no aggressive movement. It simply stopped at a considerable distance, but its presence was a silent thunder, an undeniable warning. The farmer felt his blood run cold. The lion had not left. It was watching. It had witnessed. The humiliation the farmer thought he had erased now returned, multiplied. The fear he believed he had mastered resurfaced with overwhelming force, paralyzing him in place. He looked at the old woman, still hunched on the ground, and then at the lion. A terrible understanding began to form in his mind. The lion was not merely a predator, it was a guardian, a judge, and its departure had not been a goodbye, but a pause, a test, and he, the farmer, had failed miserably. The lion took a slow step forward, then another. It was not a rush, but a deliberate walk, each movement emanating unquestionable authority. The farmer felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, or perhaps it was just the tremor of his own body. He dropped the basket, which fell with a dull thud, and raised his hands in an instinctive gesture of surrender. The lion stopped again, its eyes fixed on the man, and then with a slow and majestic movement shifted its gaze to the fallen basket. It was a silent command, a demand that could not be ignored. The farmer, his mind in a murky panic, understood. The lesson was not over. The punishment had not been complete. And he, the rich and cruel man, was once again at the mercy of the beast. The night, which had previously seemed to close in, now opened to a new and terrifying chapter. The farmer's terror was absolute. The lion's gaze, a silent judgment, pierced him completely. He had thought his ordeal was over, that he had regained his dominance, only to find himself once again a puppet in a terrifying play orchestrated by wild nature. His hands, still raised in a futile gesture of surrender, trembled uncontrollably. The basket lay at his feet, a stark reminder of his greed and cruelty. The lion's eyes, luminous in the gloom, moved from the basket to the farmer, then to the old woman still huddled on the ground, her sobs now an almost imperceptible murmur. It was as if the beast was connecting the dots, understanding the sequence of events, the farmer's despicable actions. A low, barely audible growl resonated in the lion's chest, a sound that vibrated through the very earth and through the farmer's bones. It was not a roar of attack, but a sound of deep disapproval, a warning that chilled him to the soul. "What? What do you want?" the farmer stammered, his voice failing, more a whisper of despair than a question. He knew the answer. But his mind refused to accept the humiliation. The lion took another step, and the farmer instinctively recoiled, stumbling over the fallen basket. He bent down, not to pick up the basket, but to protect himself, as if he could diminish his presence before the furious majesty. The lion stopped a few feet away, its enormous head slightly tilted. Its eyes never left the farmer, but its gaze seemed to demand something more than the simple surrender of food. There was an expectation, a lesson to be learned that went beyond the material. The farmer, in his panic, looked at the basket, then at the breadcrumbs he had crushed and thrown on the ground, mixed with the dust. The sight of the crumbs, once a symbol of his victory, was now a silent accusation. He felt a knot in his throat. The lion didn't just want the food, it wanted reparation. It wanted him to undo the wrong he had done. But how? The bread was destroyed, the fruits, the cheeses, the wine. They were there, in the basket, but the act of cruelty had already been committed. The lion let out another low growl, this time with a tone of impatience. It was a command. The farmer, trembling, reached for the basket. His fingers brushed the wicker, and he hesitated. What should he do? Simply hand it over. But the lion had not been content with that before. It had demanded that the farmer deliver the food to the old woman. With a monumental effort, the farmer forced himself to look at the old woman. She was still on the ground, huddled, her shoulders trembling. Her eyes, red and swollen, were fixed on the lion, not on the farmer. There was a strange mixture of fear and reverence in her gaze, as if she also understood the extraordinary nature of that beast. The lion, as if reading his thoughts, moved its head towards the old woman, a subtle but unmistakable movement. The message was clear. The food was for her. And the farmer was to be the instrument of that delivery. Swallowing hard, the farmer picked up the basket. The weight of the items seemed to have tripled, burdened not only by their volume, but by the weight of humiliation. He turned slowly to the old woman, each movement a torture. The distance between them was only a few steps, but it felt like an endless journey. "Here," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible, extending the basket to her. His eyes, once full of fury and contempt, were now downcast, unable to meet the gaze of the woman or the lion. It was a complete surrender, not only of the food, but of his pride. The old woman raised her head, her eyes meeting his for a brief instant. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a profound sadness and exhaustion. She extended her trembling hands, taking the basket. The touch of her wrinkled hands on his was like an electric shock. He felt her fragility, the life of suffering she carried, and for a fleeting moment, a pang of something that might have been remorse. But the lion was still there, watching, and the lesson was not over. The farmer had handed over the basket, but the lion still seemed unsatisfied. Its amber eyes moved to the ground where the breadcrumbs lay. The farmer felt a chill run down his spine. The lion did not forget. It had witnessed the destruction of the bread, the last act of cruelty. The lion took another step forward, and the farmer recoiled, stumbling again. The low growl returned, more insistent now. The farmer looked at the crumbs, then at the lion, and an even more terrible understanding struck him. The lion wanted him to undo what he had done. But how? He couldn't rebuild the bread. However, the lion's gaze was undeniable. There was an expectation of reparation, of an acknowledgement of the wrong that went beyond mere delivery. The farmer, in his despair, began to think. He had more food, in his house, in his cart. The lion, as if impatient with the slowness of his mind, let out a stronger growl. And this time a movement of its front paw, a heavy drag that kicked up dust, indicated the direction of his house, of his cart. The farmer paled. The lion didn't just want the food he had brought for the picnic. It wanted all the food. It wanted the farmer to compensate for the destruction, the humiliation, the hunger he had imposed on that woman. With shaky legs, the farmer began to walk in the direction indicated by the lion, his eyes fixed on the beast, which followed him with a vigilant gaze. The old woman, with the basket in her hands, watched the scene, a silent witness to the wild justice unfolding under the moonlight. The night, which had begun with the promise of a miracle and then closed in cruelty, now opened to a forced redemption, a reckoning imposed by nature which did not tolerate human pettiness. The farmer, the rich and cruel man, was now a servant, a prisoner of his own wickedness, guided by a four-legged judge towards a punishment he would never imagine. The farmer's walk was no longer that of a man who owned land and cattle, but that of a condemned man, dragged to his own execution. Each step was heavy, not only from the fear that paralyzed him, but from the humiliation that weighed on his shoulders like an invisible burden. The lion, a colossal and silent shadow, followed him closely, its amber eyes like relentless lighthouses in the darkness. There was no haste in the beast, only a cold and unyielding determination that turned the farmer into a mere pawn on his own chessboard. The path to the cart, which had once seemed short, now stretched like an eternity. The farmer's mind spun in a whirlwind of panic and disbelief. He, the richest man in those lands, the lord of everything his eyes could see, was being forced to obey a wild animal. The irony was a bitter poison in his throat. He had mocked the old woman, crushed her bread, and now, by a whim of nature, or perhaps fate, he was being stripped of everything. At every night sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of a cricket, the farmer flinched, expecting an attack, a final roar, but the lion remained silent, its presence more terrifying than any sound. It was the stillness of a judge who had already pronounced its sentence, merely awaiting execution. The old woman, with the basket of food now in her arms, watched the scene from afar. Her eyes, once full of despair, now carried a complex expression, a mixture of relief, shock, and an almost mystical reverence for the beast that had become her protector. She felt no triumph, only the realization that the scales of justice, however crooked, had found a brutal way to rebalance themselves. The silhouette of the farmer's cart appeared in the gloom, laden with the remains of his picnic and, more importantly, with the supplies he had brought for the journey home. Beside it, the entrance to a small barn where he kept some extra provisions was visible. The farmer's heart pounded erratically. He knew what was coming next. The lion stopped a few feet from the cart, its eyes fixed on the farmer, then on the load. A deep growl, more a tremor in the earth than an audible sound, vibrated in the air. It was the command, clear, unquestionable. The farmer was to empty the cart, not just what remained of the picnic, but everything. With trembling hands, the farmer began to untie the ropes that secured the sacks and boxes. Every movement was an act of forced surrender. He took out the heavy, full sacks of grain he had planned to sell at the town market. Then the baskets of fresh fruit, carefully picked from his own orchards, freshly baked breads, aged cheeses, bottles of fine wine, everything that represented his wealth and livelihood. With each item he removed, the lion watched, its eyes never straying. There was no hurry, no impatience, only a constant vigilance that ensured the totality of the reparation. The farmer felt sweat run down his back, not only from physical exertion but from the dread of each loss. He was surrendering his fortune, his security, his very identity piece by piece under the beast's relentless gaze. He threw the items to the ground, forming a growing pile of provisions. The lion, with a slow movement of its head, indicated the old woman. The message was clear. The food was not for the beast, but for the woman he had humiliated. The farmer, with a lump in his throat, began to carry the items towards the old woman, who still watched him, motionless, at a respectful distance. He made the first trip, then the second, his arms aching with the weight of the food and the shame. With each delivery, he avoided the old woman's gaze, unable to face the figure who, through his own cruelty, had become the center of his disgrace. The pile of food beside the old woman grew, a mountain of provisions that could feed an entire village for days. But the lion was not satisfied. Its eyes moved from the cart to the small adjacent barn. A stronger growl, a movement of its front paw towards the barn door. The farmer paled. He had stored some of his best, most valuable supplies there for a special occasion. The lion wanted everything. With a sigh that seemed to tear his soul, the farmer opened the barn door. Inside, more sacks of grain, barrels of olive oil, honey in ceramic pots, and even some pieces of salted meat. The lion would not allow him to hide anything. The punishment was complete, the reparation total. He began to remove the items from the barn, his movements now more mechanical, his mind numb with shock and exhaustion. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, and with each item he surrendered, the sense of loss deepened. He was no longer the rich farmer, but a stripped man, reduced to his most vulnerable essence, under the vigilant gaze of a predator that refused to let him escape his own wickedness. The lesson imposed by nature was being seared into his soul with a ferocity he would never forget. And the night was still far from over. With each barrel of olive oil he rolled out of the barn. With each pot of honey he carried, the farmer felt a part of himself drain away. His muscles ached, but it was the pain in his soul that consumed him. He had accumulated those riches with years of hard work, astute negotiations, a lifetime dedicated to prosperity. And now, under the merciless gaze of a predator, he surrendered them, one by one, to a woman he had treated with the purest contempt. The sacks of grain, once symbols of his abundance and security, were now just heavy burdens, each representing a slice of his crumbling empire. He threw to the ground the pieces of salted meat, carefully prepared to last for months, and the aroma of spices emanating from them was a bitter reminder of the luxury he was losing. There were also bundles of fine fabrics, which he planned to sell at the next fair, and new farm tools, waiting to be used on his vast lands. The lion would not allow him to hide anything, its amber eyes sweeping every dark corner of the barn, ensuring that the punishment was complete, the reparation total. The pile of provisions beside the old woman grew, transforming into a small mountain that defied the night's darkness. It was an amount of food and goods that could sustain not only the old woman, but an entire family, perhaps a small community, for a long time. The old woman, with the basket still in her hands, watched the scene with an almost supernatural stillness. There was no joy on her wrinkled face, not a hint of vengeance, only a deep and silent acceptance, as if nature was, finally, correcting an imbalance she had long accepted as part of her fate. The farmer, in turn, was beyond rage, beyond fear. He was numb, his movements mechanical, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief. He was a man who had always controlled his own destiny, who dictated the rules for everyone around him. Now he was a puppet, moved by the growls and gazes of a beast. The humiliation was a slow poison, corroding his arrogance, stripping him of his persona of power. He felt cold sweat trickle down his forehead, mixing with the unshed tears of his defeat. When the barn was finally empty, its shelves bare, and its floor covered only by dust and a few forgotten straws, the farmer stopped, gasping. He looked at the lion, expecting the end, liberation. But the beast did not move. Its eyes, which had previously swept the barn, now fixed in a new direction. The farmer's large house, which stood majestically a short distance away, its dark windows like empty eyes in the night. An even more intense chill ran down the farmer's spine. No, it couldn't be. His house was his sanctuary, the repository of his most precious possessions, of his personal life. The lion wanted everything. The premise of all his food, now expanded to everything he owned, to every trace of his wealth and security. The growl that followed was more a deep tremor he felt in his chest than heard with his ears. It was an unquestionable command, an ultimatum that left no room for negotiation. With shaky legs, the farmer began to walk towards his house. Each step was a torture, a funeral march for his own fortune. He felt the weight of the lion's gaze on his back, a constant presence that prevented him from fleeing, from resisting. The old woman, with the mountain of provisions at her feet, continued to watch, her fragile and silent figure now seeming the personification of justice itself. The door of the house, once a symbol of his privacy and comfort, now seemed like the entrance to a dungeon. The farmer hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the cold doorknob. The lion let out a low but firm growl, impatient with the slowness. There was no escape. He opened the door, revealing the darkness within, where his life, his history, his most intimate treasures were kept. The lesson was not over. It was only beginning to deepen, to reach the core of who he was, stripping him of everything he thought defined him. The night, which stretched like an eternity, promised to reveal the true face of humility, forged under the relentless gaze of a king of the jungle. With one last look at the beast, which remained motionless, a statue of power and vigilance in the gloom, the farmer entered the darkness of his own home. The scent of polished wood, beeswax, and a life of opulence enveloped him, a cruel contrast to the misery he had imposed on the old woman. Each step echoed in the silence, a hollow sound that seemed to announce the imminent desecration. He fumbled along the wall until he found a lantern, lighting it with trembling hands. The flickering light revealed the living room, a space adorned with solid oak furniture, Persian rugs, and oil paintings depicting idyllic landscapes and his family's ancestors. The lion, noticing the light, let out a soft but unmistakable growl from the doorway. It was a reminder that he was not alone, that every corner of the house was under its scrutiny. The farmer understood the message. There was no time for lamentations, only for obedience. He started in the living room, his eyes wandering over the objects that once represented his status and pride. First, he removed the solid silver candlesticks that adorned the fireplace, their cold, familiar weight now a burden of shame. Then, the delicate and valuable Chinese porcelain vases he had acquired at distant auctions. Each item was carefully placed on the dirt ground outside, adding to the growing mountain of goods beside the old woman. With each trip, the farmer felt a part of his soul disintegrate. He was not just surrendering objects, he was surrendering memories, the sweat of generations, the very essence of his identity. He removed the pendulum clocks, whose chimes once marked the rhythm of his prosperous life, and carried them outside, where time seemed to have stopped. The intricate tapestries that covered the walls, depicting hunting scenes and banquets, were detached with difficulty, their silk and gold threads now tangled and soiled by the night's dust. The old woman, seated amidst her new fortune, watched him with the same enigmatic stillness. Her eyes, which had seen so much misery, now contemplated the reversal of an injustice with an almost supernatural serenity. She expressed no triumph, not even surprise, only the acceptance that life, in its unpredictability, had finally tilted the scales in her favor. With each item the farmer placed near her, the pile of goods grew, a monument to his own cruelty and to divine or perhaps wild intervention. The lion, with its imposing presence, did not allow the farmer to linger. A stronger growl propelled him towards the master bedroom. There, the four-poster bed, the fine linen sheets, the silk and velvet clothes hanging in the wardrobe, everything would be stripped away. The farmer opened a cedar chest, where he kept his most precious jewels, gold rings with sparkling stones, pearl necklaces, silver coins that represented a considerable fortune. He took them out, one by one, the cold gleam of the metal and gems contrasting with the darkness of his soul. His deceased wife's wedding ring, an object of inestimable sentimental value, was torn from his finger with a knot in his throat. He threw it onto the pile, feeling a sharp pain that went beyond material loss. The humiliation was a slow poison, corroding his arrogance, stripping him of his persona of power. He felt cold sweat trickle down his forehead, mixing with the unshed tears of his defeat. The lion, like a silent executioner, watched him closely, its amber eyes fixed on every movement, ensuring that nothing was hidden, that the reparation was absolute. The farmer, once a man of possessions and pride, was now a puppet, moved by the growls and gazes of a beast, stripped of everything he thought defined him. He removed the leather-bound books from his private library, rare and expensive volumes he had collected over the years, the silver tools from his office desk, important documents, old letters. Everything was taken outside. The house, once a haven of wealth and comfort, was being emptied, its walls bare and its rooms desolate, like a skeleton of its former glory. The air was heavy with the dust and silence of loss. When the farmer, exhausted and desolate, left the house with the last object, a small iron safe containing the rest of his money and property deeds, he looked back. The house was empty, an echo of his past life, and before him the mountain of his possessions, now belonging to the woman he had tried to destroy. The lion, with a slow movement of its head, indicated that the task was complete. The punishment, the reparation, the lesson, everything had been delivered. But the night was not yet over, and the farmer knew with an icy terror that the beast still had one last demand to make. Its eyes, which had previously swept the house, now fixed on the farmer himself, and a deep growl, more a tremor in the earth than an audible sound, vibrated in the air. It was the final command, and he knew he could not escape it. The lion's final growl was not a threat of death, but something far more insidious, deeper. It was a command that penetrated the farmer's soul, promising a humiliation that would make the loss of his possessions seem a mere prelude. Its amber eyes, previously sweeping the barn and the house, now fixed on the man with an intensity that paralyzed him. The farmer felt his blood run cold, his heart pounding erratically against his ribs. He had surrendered everything he owned, every valuable object, every material memory of his life. What more could the beast want? His life. Death, at that moment, might have been a welcome relief, an escape from the shame that consumed him. But the lion did not move to attack. Instead, with a slow and deliberate movement of its head, it indicated the mountain of goods accumulated at the old woman's feet. A new chill ran down the farmer's spine. It was not the end, but a new beginning for his penance. The beast wanted him to do something with that vast fortune newly acquired by the beggar. The message was clear, though unspoken. The lesson was not just about dispossession, but about service, about the complete inversion of roles. The farmer looked at the old woman, who remained seated, a small and fragile figure amidst the opulence stolen from his life. She had not moved, her eyes fixed on the void, as if in a trance. Her indifference was sharper than any accusation. He was the man who had humiliated her, who had denied her a crumb, and now, by a whim of nature or fate, he would be her servant. With shaky legs, he took a hesitant step towards the pile of his former belongings. The lion let out a low growl, a reminder of its relentless vigilance. The farmer understood. He couldn't just stand there. He had to act. But what? Organize? Protect? The beast, as if reading his thoughts, tilted its head again, this time towards the old woman, and then towards the vast expanse of goods. A guttural sound escaped its throat, a command that resonated in the night. It was an invitation, a demand for him to approach the woman, for him to recognize the new order. With a lump in his throat, the farmer knelt before the old woman. The act was mechanical, devoid of any genuine emotion, but the weight of humiliation was overwhelming. He, the rich farmer, kneeling before the beggar he had despised. The lion watched, its eyes like embers in the darkness, ensuring that every part of the lesson was absorbed. The old woman finally moved, her eyes, previously distant, now fixed on his. There was no scorn, no triumph, only a depth of weariness and an ancient wisdom. She extended a wrinkled hand, pointing to the pile of food, the sacks of grain, the breads and cheeses he had removed from the barn. The farmer understood. Hunger was not just an abstraction to him, it was her daily reality, and now he would be the instrument of her satiety. He took a piece of fresh bread, still warm from his kitchen oven, and offered it to the woman. His hands trembled. It was the bread he had denied her, the bread she had tried to steal out of desperation. She took the bread with an almost ritualistic slowness, her thin fingers barely touching his, and then, under the watchful gaze of the lion and the farmer, she took a bite. There was no haste, no gluttony, only the acceptance of a basic need finally being met. Each chew seemed a blow to the farmer's conscience, a vivid reminder of his cruelty. The lion let out a soft growl, almost a murmur of approval. It was not the end. It was just the beginning of a new phase of punishment. The beast wanted more. It wanted him not only to deliver the food, but to serve her, to honor her, to treat her with the dignity he had always denied her. The farmer continued to offer her food, a piece of cheese, a sip of milk from a silver pitcher he had brought from his house. Each act was an exercise in humiliation, a complete inversion of his former life. He, who had never served anyone, now served the woman he considered the lowest of creatures. The night advanced, and the cold grew more intense, but the farmer did not feel the cold. He felt only the burning of shame and the weight of the lion's gaze. He was exhausted, physically and mentally. The house, now an empty skeleton, seemed to mock him. The mountain of goods, once his glory, was now the monument to his fall. When the old woman finished eating, she looked at him again. This time, there was something different in her eyes, not exactly gratitude, but a deep understanding. She did not need his words, nor his pity. She had received what was due, and nature had been the arbiter. The lion, with a majestic movement, stood up. Its eyes, which had witnessed the scene, now turned to the farmer. The growl that followed was different, laden with a finality that made him tremble. The lesson had been given, the reparation had been made, but the beast was not yet completely finished. There was one last demand, one that involved not goods or food, but the very essence of his existence. The lion looked at the farmer, and then at the vast expanse of land that stretched beyond the property to the dark horizon, as if indicating a path. And the farmer knew with an icy terror that he would no longer be the owner of those lands. He would be the dispossessed, the wanderer, the man who had lost everything for a lesson in humility. The farmer's world, already in ruins, disintegrated into dust. Not only his possessions, not only his pride, but the very ground beneath his feet, the legacy of generations, his home. That look from the lion, fixed on the dark horizon, was a sentence of exile, crueler than any prison, for it imprisoned him in his own conscience, with no walls to protect him from the truth that imposed itself. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, constricted by a terror so profound it prevented him from breathing. "No, please." The words were a pathetic whisper, lost in the vast silence of the night. The lion did not growl, did not move. It merely kept its gaze fixed, a relentless beacon pointing to the unknown. The message was clear, undeniable. He was to go, leave everything. The old woman, seated among the mountain of goods, watched the scene with the same imperturbable calm. Her eyes, which had witnessed so much pain and now so much upheaval, showed neither pity nor satisfaction, only the acceptance of a cycle completing itself, of scales that finally tipped. She was the silent witness to the fall of an empire built on cruelty and indifference. The farmer, with a searing pain in his chest, turned to the empty house. The bare walls seemed to mock him. The desolate rooms echoed his own desolation. That was his life, his refuge, his throne. And now it was just a hollow shell, a reminder of his arrogance. He had nothing left, not even the right to remain there, on the land he once called his own. With one last look at the old woman, who now seemed like a queen on her improvised throne of wealth, the farmer felt a pang of something that was not anger, but a bitter recognition. She had not asked for this. Nature or fate had acted for her, and he, the tormentor, had become the victim of his own wickedness, stripped of everything by the very power he had tried to oppress. He took a step, then another, moving away from the house, from the pile of goods, from the woman, from the lion. Each step was a farewell, a severance from the past. The ground beneath his feet felt strange, no longer his own. The night air, once familiar, now carried the scent of his defeat, of his insignificance. He had nowhere to go, no plan, no hope. Only the vastness of the night and the uncertainty of tomorrow, a future as empty as the house he left behind. The lion, with a slow and majestic movement, turned and walked towards the forest, disappearing into the darkness as silently as it had appeared. Its task was complete. The scales had been rebalanced. Justice, wild and relentless, had been delivered, and the beast, like a spirit of nature, withdrew, leaving the man to face the consequences of his actions. The farmer continued to walk aimlessly, without direction. The stars above seemed to mock his insignificance, each one a cold eye observing his fall. The chill of dawn penetrated his bones, but it was the cold in his soul that consumed him. He was a man without a name, without a home, without purpose. The lesson had been brutal, complete. He had lost everything he valued, and in the process, perhaps, found something he never knew he lacked: humility, the true essence of existence. With each step that took him further from his old life, the image of the old woman, seated amidst her newly acquired fortune, was etched into his mind. She, whom he had denied a cup of milk, now possessed more than he had ever had, and he, who had considered himself the master of all, was now less than a beggar, for he did not even possess the dignity of his own choice. He was an outcast, an exile in his own land. The sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple. The morning light revealed the landscape. But to the farmer, everything seemed grey, devoid of color and life. He looked back one last time. The house, now distant, seemed a tiny, almost invisible speck, swallowed by the vastness of the land. And the old woman. She would be there, perhaps sleeping among her new treasures, or perhaps already preparing for a new life, a life of dignity and abundance. The truth was, he didn't know, and it didn't matter. His journey was now forward into the unknown, carrying only the weight of his actions and the memory of the beast that had stripped him of his arrogance. He was a new man, forged in the fire of humiliation, stripped of everything, but perhaps for the first time in his life, free. Free from the prison of his own greed, free from the blindness of his own power. The path ahead was uncertain, but the lesson seared into his soul would be his only compass. The night had ended, but the penance he knew was just beginning. He was the farmer, dispossessed, wandering, and the vastness of the world was now his only home and his only punishment. With each step, the echo of the lion's growl seemed to guide his feet, not towards death, but towards a new and painful existence, where each dawn would be a reminder of his fall and his redemption. The sun, a disk of fire on the horizon, brought no warmth to the farmer. It brought only the rawness of a new reality, painting the world with colors he had never noticed or had deliberately ignored. Each ray seemed an accusing finger, illuminating his insignificance. The morning air, once pure and invigorating, now carried the scent of his own defeat, a metallic aroma of shame and despair. His feet, accustomed to the softness of Persian rugs and the polished floors of his house, now dragged on the beaten earth, kicking up dust that clung to his torn trousers. He no longer had fine clothes, leather shoes, only what he wore, and that was already marked by the cold night and humiliation. With each step, the echo of the lion's growl seemed to guide his feet, not towards death, but towards a new and painful existence, where each dawn would be a reminder of his fall and his redemption. Penance was not a single event, but a journey, a seemingly endless path, where each mile traveled was a chapter of his new and bitter education. Hunger began to gnaw at his insides, a sensation he had imposed on so many but had never truly experienced. It was a dull, persistent ache, joining physical exhaustion and mental torment. His body, once well-fed and robust, now seemed an empty shell, weak and vulnerable. He walked for hours, not knowing where to go. The roads he once traversed in his luxurious cart now stretched before him like a cruel labyrinth. Every tree, every stone, every stream seemed to watch him, silent witnesses to his fall. He was a ghost on his own land, an exile in a kingdom he once ruled with an iron fist. No one recognized him, or if they did, they averted their gaze, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of contempt. He was the man who had fallen, and his fall was a silent spectacle for all who knew him. Loneliness was a constant companion, heavier than any physical burden. Thirst began to tighten his throat, and he found himself searching for a source of water, something that had always been at his disposal before. He remembered the milk he had denied the old woman, the fresh water that gushed from his taps. The irony was a slow poison, corroding his soul. He knelt by a small stream, drinking the cold, muddy water with cupped hands, a primitive act that connected him to his new condition. There was no silver pitcher, no crystal goblet. Only the harshness of nature, which he had tried to dominate, now dominated him. The sun rose higher, and the day's heat began to punish him. His skin, accustomed to shade and comfort, burned. He had no hat, no protection. He was an easy target for the elements, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. The exhaustion was overwhelming, and he felt the desire to simply lie down and give up. But the echo of the lion's growl, the image of the imposing beast, prevented him. There was an invisible force, a compulsion that pushed him forward, towards the penance he knew was necessary. He passed through fields that were once his, where his workers toiled under his command. Now, the fields seemed strange, the crops indifferent to his presence. He was a stranger on his own land. No one recognized him, or if they did, they averted their gaze, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of contempt. He was the man who had fallen, and his fall was a silent spectacle for all who knew him. Loneliness was a constant companion, heavier than any physical burden. As the day advanced, the pain in his feet and legs became unbearable. Every muscle ached, every joint protested. He had never worked so hard in his life, never felt such exhaustion, but there was no rest, no shelter. The vast expanse of the world was now his only home, and his only punishment. He was the farmer, dispossessed, wandering, and with each step, the echo of the lion's growl seemed to guide his feet, not towards death, but towards a new and painful existence, where each dawn would be a reminder of his fall and his redemption. Night approached again, and with it the cold and the darkness. He had nowhere to sleep, no way to keep warm. The prospect of another night under the open sky, without food or comfort, was terrifying, but he had no choice. He was a man with nothing, and the world, once his plaything, was now his tormentor. He searched for a place to shelter, a small indentation in a rock, a tangle of bushes, anything that could offer a minimum of protection against the biting wind. As he prepared for another night of torment, he looked at the stars. They shone with an intensity he had never noticed before, a spectacle of beauty indifferent to his misery. And for the first time, perhaps, he felt a pang of something that was not anger or regret, but a strange sense of humility. He was just a tiny speck in the vast universe, and his past arrogance now seemed a cruel joke. The lion's lesson, seared into his soul, was only beginning to unravel its multiple meanings. The night had ended, but the penance, he knew, was just beginning. The second night fell like a heavy cloak over the farmer. The cold, previously just an annoyance, was now a torture that penetrated his bones, making him tremble uncontrollably. The indentation in the rock he had found offered little protection against the biting wind that howled like a hungry wolf. Each gust seemed to carry away a piece of his already fragile hope. He huddled, hugging his knees to his chest, trying to retain the minimal warmth his exhausted body could still generate. The darkness was total, punctuated only by the indifferent stars, which seemed even more distant and mocking. Hunger, which had previously been a dull ache, now manifested in sharp stomach cramps, an emptiness that seemed to consume his very essence. He thought of the abundant food he had wasted, the banquets he hosted to flaunt his wealth. He remembered the fresh bread, the aged cheese, the succulent meats. Each memory was a stab, a cruel reminder of his old life and the irony of his current situation. He, who had denied a hungry old woman a cup of milk, now felt the agony of deprivation in his own flesh. Thirst also persisted, a harsh dryness in his throat that made it difficult even to swallow. Sleep did not come. Every attempt to close his eyes was interrupted by vivid images of his fall, the imposing lion. Its flaming eyes, the growl that still echoed in his mind. The image of the old woman seated amidst her fortune was the most persistent, a ghost of his own cruelty. He saw the smile on her lips, not a smile of triumph, but of peace, of a dignity he had tried to steal from her and that she now possessed in abundance. And he, the once powerful, was a rag, a spectre of himself. With each passing hour, the weight of his actions became more unbearable. It was not just physical pain, but the pain of conscience, a burden he had never felt before. He had lived a life of selfishness, of exploitation, believing that his wealth made him immune to consequences. Now nature, through its wildest manifestation, had shown him the truth. No one is above justice, especially when it is imposed by a primordial force. In the distance, he heard the howl of a coyote, a sound he would once have ignored or sent his dogs to chase away. Now, the sound filled him with a primitive fear, a fear he had never known in his fortress of luxury. He was just another animal in the night, vulnerable, exposed. The hierarchy he had established in his mind, with himself at the top, had been brutally inverted. Dawn brought with it a grey sunrise, without the vibrant colours of the previous day. The sun, still hidden by clouds, seemed reluctant to illuminate his misery. He rose, every muscle protesting, every joint creaking. His feet were swollen and sore, with blisters that had burst and now burned. The exhaustion was so profound that he felt each step as a monumental effort. He continued his aimless journey, following a narrow trail that snaked through thorny bushes. The landscape was desolate, reflecting the emptiness in his soul. He passed through a small village, a cluster of humble houses he had never noticed before, always rushing past in his cart. This time, he saw the faces of the people, marked by work and simple life. No one recognized him, or if they did, their eyes showed nothing but indifference, perhaps a remnant of fear from a past he represented. He was invisible, a ghost walking among the living. Hunger drove him to a desperate decision. He saw a small orchard, the trees laden with ripe fruit. In his old life, he would have sent his foreman to chase away anyone who dared touch his property. Now he was the intruder, the thief. With his heart pounding in his chest, he snuck among the trees, gathering some fallen apples from the ground. The taste of the fruit, sweet and succulent, was the most delicious food he had ever tasted, not for luxury, but for pure necessity, for survival. It was a stolen meal, but without the guilt of before, only gratitude for appeasing his hunger. As he ate, he sat under the shade of a tree, watching a group of children playing. They laughed, ran, their innocent voices echoing in the air. He remembered his own childhood, a time before greed consumed him, before he became the man he was. A pang of regret, deeper than any other, struck him. He had lost his innocence, his simple joy, in his relentless pursuit of power and wealth. The echo of the lion's growl, which had once been a reminder of his punishment, now seemed to have a new meaning. It was not just a sound of threat, but a call, a guide to a new existence. A stripped-down existence, yes, but perhaps for the first time, an authentic one. He was no longer the rich farmer, the feared man. He was just a man, naked of his possessions, naked of his pretensions. The journey continued, the sun rose, and the day's heat began to make itself felt again. But this time, there was a subtle difference. The pain was still there, the exhaustion still overwhelming. But something within him had changed. The humility that had blossomed the night before was deepening, transforming into a silent acceptance of his fate. He was no longer fighting reality, but embracing it, step by step. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stop. The path ahead was uncertain, but the lesson, seared into his soul, would be his only compass. Penance was not a single event, but a journey, a seemingly endless path, where each mile traveled was a chapter of his new and bitter education. He was the farmer, dispossessed, wandering, and with each step, the echo of the lion's growl seemed to guide his feet, not towards death, but towards a new and painful existence, where each dawn would be a reminder of his fall and his redemption. The night had ended, but the penance, he knew, was just beginning, and with it, the possibility of a new beginning, forged in the furnace of loss and humility. The third morning brought not relief, but an intensification of the ordeal. The farmer's body, already punished, now seemed in total rebellion. Every muscle fiber screamed, every bone ached with a persistence that defied the very notion of human endurance. The blisters on his feet had turned into open wounds, and each step was a searing agony, a cruel reminder of the distance he still had to travel. The sun, which had once been a source of comfort, now beat relentlessly on his burned skin, draining his last reserves of energy. Thirst was a constant torture. His mouth dry and cracked, his throat rough as sandpaper, he yearned for water, for any drop of moisture that could relieve the burning inside him. The image of his wells, always full and at his disposal, haunted him, a ghost of his former abundance. The irony was cruel. He, who owned lands with crystal-clear springs, now crawled like a thirsty animal. The humility that had begun to sprout in his heart now transformed into a deep, almost resigned acceptance. He no longer fought against fate, but surrendered to it, a willing prisoner of his own penance. Pride, once an impenetrable wall, crumbled into dust with each painful step. He was just a man, stripped of everything, and this nakedness was, paradoxically, the only thing he had left. He continued to follow the trail, now more an animal track than a human path. The vegetation grew denser, thorny bushes scratching his skin, tearing his already ragged clothes. Fear, which had been a constant companion, now mingled with a strange apathy. What else could happen? He had already lost everything. Death, at times, seemed a welcome relief, but the echo of the lion's growl, persistent in his mind, prevented him from giving up. It was not a growl of death, but of warning, of a lesson not yet fully learned. By midday, the heat became unbearable. He spotted a small stream, a thread of water winding between the stones. With his last strength, he dragged himself to the bank, falling to his knees. The water, cold and clear, was a balm for his parched throat. He drank avidly, feeling life slowly return to his veins. As he drank, he saw his reflection on the surface. A thin, bearded face, deep-set, reddened eyes. The image of a broken man. He barely recognized himself. The rich, vain and imposing farmer had disappeared, replaced by a spectre of himself. He remained there for a long time, the water washing away not only his thirst, but also some of the dirt and despair. He remembered the old woman, the thirst she must have felt, the hunger that drove her to steal. Guilt, once an abstract weight, was now a physical pain, a knot in his stomach. He had been blind, selfish, unable to see humanity in the eyes of those who suffered. The lion had not punished him only for stealing his food, but for stealing his compassion. Upon rising, he felt a new determination, not to fight but to endure. The journey was no longer just a punishment, but a purification. He needed to continue, not to survive, but to understand. What did the lion want from him? What did life want from him? He followed the course of the stream, hoping it would lead him somewhere, anywhere. The landscape began to change, the trees growing taller and denser, forming a dark and mysterious forest. Sunlight filtered through in sparse beams, creating a somber and oppressive atmosphere. The air became more humid and heavy, laden with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. The tension increased. The forest was an unknown and dangerous place, very different from the open fields he knew. Strange sounds echoed among the trees, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches, the distant calls of nocturnal birds. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat, every movement a lurking beast. He was once again in the lion's territory, or something even wilder. Exhaustion hit him again, but he refused to stop. The image of the old woman now was no longer one of accusation, but of inspiration. She had endured so much, survived on so little. He needed to be strong, not for himself, but for the lesson being taught. Night fell quickly in the forest, transforming twilight into total darkness in a matter of minutes. The cold returned, more intense and penetrating beneath the dense canopy of trees. He found no shelter, only the base of an ancient tree with twisted roots that looked like claws. He huddled there, trembling, listening to the sounds of the night come alive, the distant howl of a wolf, the hoot of an owl, the rustling of something large and heavy moving in the darkness. Primitive fear returned, stronger than ever. It was not the fear of losing his wealth, but the fear of annihilation, of insignificance. He was just a piece of meat in nature's vast and indifferent tapestry. And then he heard it, not the distant growl that guided him, but a closer, deeper sound that made the ground vibrate beneath him, a roar, a lion's roar. It was not a warning, but a presence. The beast was close, very close. The farmer's heart pounded, and he huddled even tighter, closing his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. The lesson, he realized, was not yet over. And perhaps it would never end. Penance was an endless journey, and each new day brought with it a new layer of suffering and perhaps a new revelation. He was the farmer, stripped, wandering, and now hunted. The roar. It was no longer a distant echo in his mind, but a sound wave that hit him with the force of a punch, making the ground tremble beneath his huddled body. The thin air of the dense forest seemed to suck all the oxygen from his lungs, and the farmer's heart, already exhausted, pounded at a frantic pace, threatening to tear through his chest. He closed his eyes so tightly that he saw stars dance in the darkness, awaiting the impact, the final pain, the annihilation that seemed to be the only possible outcome for that endless penance. But the impact did not come. Instead, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the forest, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the rustling of dry leaves, as if something large and heavy was moving slowly, inexorably towards him. He opened his eyes, hesitant, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Emerging from the darkness, like a living and imposing shadow, was the lion. It was not a dream vision or a feverish hallucination, but the brutal, palpable reality, just a few feet away. Its deep amber eyes glowed with a terrifying intelligence, fixed on him, as if weighing him, judging every fiber of his being. The majestic mane, dark and dense, framed a face that exuded power and ancient wisdom. Every muscle under its golden skin seemed to pulsate, ready to act, but the animal remained motionless, a statue of pure strength and intent. The farmer couldn't move. Fear paralyzed him, turning his limbs to lead. He was prey, insignificant, at the mercy of a force that transcended anything he had ever known. It was not the fear of death itself, but the fear of powerlessness, of the absolute lack of control over his own destiny. He, who had always controlled everything, was now less than nothing. The lion took a slow, deliberate step, and the sound of its paws on the forest floor echoed like thunder in the stillness. The farmer felt a wild, strong scent of earth and beast envelop him, suffocating him. He waited for the pounce, for the end. But the lion stopped again, at a distance that seemed both intimate and infinitely vast. Its eyes showed no rage, no predatory hunger, but a depth of judgment that was even more terrifying. It was as if the lion could read his soul, unravel every act of cruelty, every selfish thought he had harbored in his past life. Then the lion did something unexpected. Instead of advancing, it turned its head slightly to the right, and let out a low, guttural growl, which was not a direct threat, but an unquestionable command. It was a sound that said, "Continue, do not stop." Though the farmer understood. It was not the end. It was a new phase of the ordeal. He would not be killed there, not yet. He would be guided, or rather hunted, forced to proceed under the beast's relentless vigilance. With a superhuman effort, trembling, he managed to stand. Every movement was a torture, but the alternative was unthinkable. The lion watched him, its amber eyes never straying. He began to walk, stumbling in the direction the lion had indicated. The forest seemed even darker and more menacing now, but the fear of the lion, so close, was a more potent catalyst than any physical pain. He was a puppet, his steps guided not by his own will, but by the imposing presence of the beast behind him. With each step, he expected to feel claws, teeth, but the lion maintained a constant distance, a golden and silent shadow following him. The night advanced, and the journey under the lion's vigilance was a waking nightmare. Exhaustion was overwhelming, but fear prevented him from falling. He stumbled over roots, scratched himself on thorns, but continued, driven by a primitive terror. The farmer's mind, once so full of calculations and plans to increase his wealth, now was empty of everything except the urgency to survive and the constant awareness of the lion's presence. He remembered the old woman, his own hunt for her, the way he had pursued and humiliated her. The irony was brutal. He, the hunter, was now the hunted. He, who had denied food and compassion, was now forced on a journey of deprivation and fear under the aegis of a predator who was, paradoxically, his master. The lesson was clear, seared into his soul. Humility was not a choice, but an imposition. Compassion was not a luxury, but a necessity. The sun began to peek through the treetops, casting pale beams of light over the forest. The farmer, his body in tatters and his mind on the verge of collapse, felt a momentary relief with the arrival of day. But the lion was still there, a constant presence, a reminder that the penance was not over. They reached a clearing, a small open space where sunlight could finally touch the ground. In the center of the clearing, there was a small, rustic, humble cabin, the kind he would have ignored or ordered, torn down in his old life. A faint smoke rose from the chimney. The smell of something cooking, simple but warm, wafted through the air. The lion stopped at the edge of the clearing, its eyes fixed on the cabin, and then again on the farmer. A low, deep growl escaped its throat, a sound he now recognized as a command. "Go!" The farmer felt a chill. What awaited him there? A new ordeal, a new humiliation. He looked at the lion, which seemed to wait, observing his every move. There was no choice. With his last strength, he dragged himself to the cabin, the smell of food both drawing him in and terrifying him. He was the farmer, stripped, wandering, hunted, and now led to an unknown threshold, where the next stage of his bitter redemption awaited him. The lion's lesson was far from over. The smell of smoke and something cooking, simple but undeniably warm, was both torture and a promise. Every fiber of the farmer's body cried out for that sustenance, but the fear of the lion, the golden and silent shadow at the edge of the clearing, was a relentless master. He dragged himself to the cabin door, a structure of rough wood and thatched roof, so different from the mansions he had built for himself. The wood creaked under his hesitant touch, and he pushed the door, which opened with a groan. Inside, the light was dim, coming from a small crackling fire in the center of the single room. The warmth was a balm for his chilled bones. But what truly struck him was the sight. Hanging over the fire, a cauldron gently bubbled, exuding a rich aroma of vegetable stew and perhaps some game meat. On a rustic table, a piece of dark bread and a mug of fresh water awaited. It was a simple meal, but for him, who hadn't eaten in days, it seemed a feast fit for kings. His stomach rumbled in protest, and bitter saliva filled his mouth. And then he saw her. Seated on a low stool beside the fire, wrapped in a worn shawl, was the old woman, the same woman he had pursued, humiliated, and denied a sip of milk. Her eyes, once full of despair and hunger, now watched him with a strange, almost serene calm. There was no anger, no triumph, only an infinite patience, as if she knew this encounter was inevitable. She seemed more fragile than he remembered, but her presence radiated a dignity that made him feel even smaller. The farmer stopped, paralyzed. Hunger was a sharp knife in his stomach, but shame was an overwhelming weight in his chest. He had been led here, to a place where his victim awaited him, and where the food he so craved was in plain sight. The lesson was brutally clear. This was his food, the reward for his journey of suffering, but he knew with a visceral certainty that it was not for him. Outside, a low, deep growl echoed, making the cabin walls vibrate. The lion. He didn't need to see it to feel its imposing presence, its relentless vigilance. The growl was not a threat but a reminder, a silent but unquestionable command. "This is your final trial. This is your food. What will you do with it?" The farmer felt a knot in his throat. He looked at the steaming stew, at the bread, at the water. His mind screamed for him to throw himself at the table, to devour everything, to satisfy the searing pain of hunger. But the image of the old woman, her calm and patient eyes, stopped him. He remembered his own cruel words, his refusal to offer her the bare minimum. He had denied her, and now nature, through the lion, was demanding his own denial. With trembling hands, the farmer approached the table. Every movement was a battle against his own survival instinct. He picked up the mug of water, feeling the coolness on his cracked palms. Instead of bringing it to his lips, he extended it to the old woman. Their eyes met. In hers, he saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. She took the mug, her thin, wrinkled fingers barely touching his. Next, he picked up the bread. The smell of yeast and earth was almost unbearable. He broke it in half, offering the larger portion to her. And then, with a sigh that seemed to release years of selfishness, he walked to the cauldron. With a wooden ladle, he served a generous portion of the stew into an earthenware bowl and handed it to the woman. The old woman accepted everything in silence, her eyes never leaving his. She showed no surprise, no exaggerated gratitude, just a quiet acceptance. She began to eat, slowly, with a dignity that made him feel even more humiliated and, paradoxically, lighter. The farmer recoiled, feeling empty, but not from hunger. It was a different emptiness, a space where greed and cruelty had once been, and which was now beginning to be filled with something new. He sat on the cold ground, watching her eat. The small portion of bread he had kept for himself seemed tasteless, unimportant. He was no longer hungry, not with that physical hunger at least. Outside, the lion's growl sounded again, this time softer, almost a murmur. It was not a command, but a recognition, a sign that the lesson had been learned. The farmer looked at the door, and for an instant he thought he saw the majestic silhouette of the lion moving away, disappearing into the darkness of the forest, like a spirit of justice that had fulfilled its mission. The night advanced, and the farmer remained there, on the cabin floor, feeling the warmth of the fire and the silent presence of the old woman. He was no longer the rich farmer, nor the terrified man. He was just a man, stripped of everything, but with a new vision. Compassion, he realized, was not a weakness, but true strength. Humility was not a punishment, but a path to redemption. The sun rose, filtering through the cracks in the cabin, painting the dirt floor with golden stripes. The old woman still slept, serene. The farmer got up, feeling a different pain now, not the pain of exhaustion or fear, but the pain of regret and the promise of a new beginning. He left the cabin to the clearing where the lion had led him. The air was fresh and the birds sang. The forest no longer seemed threatening, but full of life. He looked back, at the humble cabin, and then at the vast forest. His path was not back to his old life, to his wealth and his lands. His path was forward to an unknown future, where he would seek not to accumulate, but to serve, not to punish, but to forgive. The lion had stripped him of everything, but in return had given him something infinitely more valuable, his humanity. The penance had ended, and the purification had begun. He was the farmer, yes, but now a transformed man, guided not by greed, but by the compassion the lion had forced him to find.